process. Okay, so you have to appreciate that. It's not a simple situation where a pain signal comes from a knee or from an ankle or from an arm, and that's all it is. We've moved a long way past that. So first consideration is that pain as an experience is a very multifactorial process. So, and one of my favourite little sayings as it relates to pain is that everything affects everything. As we explore this topic more, you will soon understand what I mean by that. Well, we all know that it comes at a high price, whether it be for athletes or the general population. In Australia alone, the impact of pain on productivity and the like is now in the billions of dollars, and the incidence of chronic and complex pain is changing enormously as well. I know this is probably not a topic that relates as much to you, but I'll certainly just touch on this. If you look in the treatment world, whether physio, chiro, osteo, massage therapist, whoever, everyone is going to have an approach for treating what is pain. Okay. Now, some approaches are quite fixed and rigid, and some are a little bit more open-minded in the way that they manage things. My philosophy across the course of my career has been to try and take the best elements of research, treatment approaches, and apply that as one overall program. Which is why when you look at where our company and organisation is now, in terms of having the exercise component to what we do, that's a vision that I had 15, 20 years ago because of how I felt exercise falls, not only in high performance, but just in well-being. Okay, so one of the big frontiers that I think across your careers that you'll notice a huge growth in is going to be looking at the influence of nutrition, clinical nutrition, the immune function as it relates to the gut and what effect that has on pain. And that's a fascinating topic for the athlete. And I think we should explore that. The cycling team that I get to work with, Drapac Pro Cycling, this is a huge element of what the guys get up to in terms of screening of their gut health and ways that you can improve performance at the elite level by changing diet, clinical nutrition, and even microbe levels in the gut. Okay, so you won't hear a lot about that in the elite sports world, but that's going to be a huge frontier in the next, I think, 5 to 10 years. Okay, so, but if you've got, as we're talking, if there's things that you think you want to hear about, just make sure you let Hannah know. So we've talked about this topic about the fact that we as professionals, and as you as a health profession, you need to change your perspective and change your knowledge in this area. I was called up by a newspaper last week to discuss pain, and for me, my comment was really around the fact that for the most part in the medical world, most people don't understand pain very well, yet people happily treat people without understanding it. It's quite scary when you think of it, what goes on out there in the real world. So, and I probably should preface this by saying that for about 15 of the 22 odd years that I've been a clinician, most of that time has been spent dealing with complex pain issues with patients. So it's kind of been something that I've had a passion for a while. So initially, when you looked at the models for understanding pain, they were very based around mechanical considerations, fractures and the like. You may have seen this photo before where the man puts his foot on the fire, there was a signal that came to the brain, and that's how you knew you're injuring your foot. We now know it's far more complex than that, and we've moved from this very tissue-based mechanism to this very integrative approach to why people experience pain. So you end up with this type of situation, where these are some of the considerations that you should be thinking of when someone tells you that they've got pain. So if we start at the top, medical conditions influence pain. Process of central sensitization, have you heard of that term before? No. Well, that's something that we need to talk about. That's very, very important for you to understand when you're dealing with athletes, what that means. People's beliefs. So this is a really interesting exercise, and I do this when I present on this topic. If we were to start down with John, if I was to ask you why people have pain, what would you say? Just very briefly.
Core philosophy comes to mind.
Okay, so more mechanical things. Yep.
Neurophysiology.
neuromuscular. Yeah.
That feels something hurting.
Yeah. Yeah. So still probably structural. Yeah.
I think it's like muscle tissue.
Yeah. I'm not picking on you, but still structural. Yeah. Structural. So this is, so as a general theme, most of you are kind of still seeing this structural tissue-based model, okay, which is fine. But now if you start to think about beliefs, age, the immune system, people's culture, these are all things that through research we know can influence why someone experiences pain. And you'll often hear me keep saying that term, experience of pain, because pain ultimately is an experience, it's not an input. So one of the critical things you always have to understand when you're thinking about pain, pain is not an input to the nervous system, it is an output. Okay? It is what your brain is telling you. Okay?
Yeah, do you understand that? So you cut your finger doesn't tell your brain that it's painful. Your brain receives the information that there's been tissue damage there, the situation that they're in is deemed to be threatening based on previous experience.
Hold that thought. I've got to expand on that in a second. Yep. Gender, diet, inflammation, stress. How can stress affect pain? Any thoughts?
Will they do to see that the pain's more?
What can you tell me about the biochemical effect of stress on your body?
Cortisol, hypertension.
Cortisol. Yep. Do you know what cortisol does? Is it good for your immune system or bad for your immune system? Highly destructive. Okay. So stress links to the immune system. The immune system links to inflammation. Okay. So all of these things, when I was saying before, everything affects everything. This is what we're starting to talk about. Changes in the body map. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. Previous experience, thoughts, genetics play a part. Injury, knowledge, all of these things. So if an athlete comes up to you and goes, I've got a sore knee, you'll need to start to think beyond, okay, is it a patellofemoral problem? Is it because you're not activating your muscles well? Is it because you're not landing properly? They're all considerations, and in most cases with the athlete, tissue-based approaches are okay, but I'm telling you now, it goes well beyond that. And if you as exercise scientists and one day EPs, if that's what you end up becoming, you understand this, you'll be on another level compared to your peers. So that's why I would encourage you to hopefully listen to this stuff. So there's definitely gaps, okay? So do we need to, we've just talked about our own beliefs, and we can see in this room that we have a very dominant tissue-based model to why people experience pain, which is completely understandable, right? So, just jump through this. So when you start to look in a simple way at, this is what Matt was coming to talk about, at the process of input, processing and output. So this is often the simplest way to start to expand your clinical reasoning as it relates to pain, is that we know that we're getting a barrage and a variety of sensory inputs. Now if anyone wants a copy of this, by all means let me know, I'll put it on a USB for you. You've got various inputs coming from the tissues, sensory inputs, proprioceptive inputs, all of those things. So all of these inputs are giving your brain a sense of how healthy your body is. Do you agree with that? It's like, the analogy that I use is that you've kind of got all these satellites orbiting the Earth, our brain, constantly providing input back about the state of how healthy the Earth is. Right? Now, what happens beyond that is that you now need to think about this process being greater than just this simple one-to-one relationship between having an injury and pain. We now have a framework which our genetically determined body map is compared against actual input. And this is, I think, if you can understand, this is from Ronald Malzahn. It's been a little while ago, but if you think about it this way, we have a genetic map of our body. Just say it's this, okay, for argument's sake, right? And if my input is the same, so the input is matching the expectation, your nervous system is happy. Does that all make sense? Right, so here's this input coming in all the time, there's a great match, your brain's happy, it doesn't sense that there's any potential or actual tissue damage. Right, does that make sense to everyone? Now all of a sudden if I do this, right, I've changed sensory input. Now we have a mismatch. So what is your brain now going to think? if there's a mismatch, something's wrong. Now, it could be actual or it could be potential tissue damage, and that's another important consideration, is that you can have situations where you do actually injure or damage tissue, but there's other cases where your brain just gets, if it gets a change, for example, in proprioceptive input, that's enough for it to go, this no longer matches, there could be something wrong. Therefore, I'm going to make this area hurt. Okay? And think of pain in regions too. This is something I stress to our clinical team all the time. If someone comes up to me and goes, oh, they've got patellofemoral pain, or they've got pain in their wrist joint, your brain doesn't think of it that way. Your brain thinks of it, there's knee region pain, there's wrist region pain, there's low back region pain. It's not cognitively we have the ability to go, actually I can show you where it is, but just because pain's in a region doesn't mean that the underlying tissues are at fault. Right? Because every now and then you've all would have heard of the concept of referred pain. That can be a pretty strong force in why people are experiencing symptoms. So expanding on that, you now need to consider the impact of genetic contributions, the impact of the endocrine system, sensory input, the immune system. All of these things that we now know through research influence pain. And this is a study that was done, well, if you think back now, this is like 15 years ago. Good research. This is a paper called the Neuromatrix Theory of Pain. If you were going to read one paper on pain, it would be that. If you understand that, you'll be a great clinician dealing with athletes. And if you always bring it back to this actual, your body map and what's happening, if you try and match the two up with exercise prescription, proprioceptive retraining, body awareness training, you'll generally, in most cases, get a great outcome even in the most complex of presentations. So now we start to expand on this input processing and output model, and we now start to think about inputs to the body self, so that internal body map that we all have. And so all of a sudden now memories, beliefs, and meaning. Now, if you think about your ACL rehab patients, there's even a really good podcast that was out recently discussing how the psychology of returning to sport is powerful. So do you know now that, and this is something that I used to talk about years ago, that with athletes returning to sport, in theory, you should have them out on the football field, for example, if they're an AFL footballer, so they get the smell of the grass. You should, in theory, probably put some crowd noise on in the background. You should, in theory, run through the same pre-game routines that would before someone actually runs onto the field to train or do their ACL rehab. Why?
So that separation, anxiety, or
because memory is such a powerful thing. Now, if you look at some of the studies that look at the impact, so I'm sure you've all had that experience where you there's a particular smell that you might smell, and straight away it evokes an image of something, often from childhood. Does that make sense to you? I'm sure you've all had that. Straight away you can see how memory links to, smell links to memory, and it evokes certain emotions. So you imagine with an athlete, they tear their ACL, okay, and they're laying down, holding their knee in pain on a footy ground with freshly cut grass. What do you think the smell of freshly cut grass will evoke in that athlete if they walk outside and someone just they're going to get a little bit more adrenaline. This is why these things are important. You can't blow them off and you can't say, oh, get over it type thing. You have to actually put a strategy in place. And sometimes for athletes that involves psychology and cognitive behavioural techniques. But that's certainly something you need to consider, the cognition of those inputs. The sensory stuff, this is where, for you as clinicians, you're going to have a huge impact. Changing proprioception, changing patterning, changing the way information comes into the nervous system. Of course, emotion-related stuff, the psychology of input is very important. All of that input is going to be interpreted and considered by a whole, by various parts of the brain to generate some output. So if you look at the outputs now, well, pain could be one of those things. What's another output-based system of the human body? In terms of the way the nervous system works. So we've talked about sensory input, we've talked about processing. What's output-based? Motor system, absolutely. It's your world. If you're trying to change output, you better pay attention to input. Okay? So motor, the other one is the sympathetic system as well. Okay? But your world is the motor world. But your world needs to consider the input world. Because if you do not change input, you will not change output. Okay? So this is where the integration of sensory training, proprioceptive training, that's very important for motor function. And it flows on to what we were touching on before about the neuroendocrine system as well, your hormone system, your immune system. Okay. How are we going? Is everyone going okay? How much time have we got that? 5 minutes?
I can't check.
It's 10, almost 10 past.
Yeah, you can go 5, 10.
Okay. Right. So, have you seen this picture in your neuroanatomy textbooks?
Should have seen this a couple of weeks ago. In one of our tubes.
So, do you understand what this means? Yes? No? If you don't, tell me. Yeah. So this is fundamentally how our brain on a sensory level perceives us. Big head, big hands, big feet, and big genitals, essentially. Right? So, and if you think about this, it's quite fascinating. I was talking to Matt about this. Do you notice how the hands are next to the face? Yeah? In utero, where are your hands? Yeah. So isn't it interesting how the fetal position that matches this? Because where are your feet? They're next to your lower back. No. It's quite, I find that fascinating that that's kind of how we start. In terms of the development of the human nervous system, it's that. But obviously, with the large amount of small muscles in our face and hands and the strong need for accurate sensory input from these regions, it makes sense in the brain why we need more space in those areas. What you have to appreciate about this map is not fixed, it does change. So, 2 take-home messages from this. In chronic low back pain, the map for the lumbopelvic area gets bigger. Alright? In cases of hand and foot pain, it shrinks, it goes the opposite way. Alright, so some interesting studies that looked at people that had had traumatic hand injuries, amputations, for example. If I take these 2 fingers away, I no longer have any sensory input from my small finger and my ring finger. I've kind of got space for rent in my brain. So which part of the brain or of the sensory cortex do you think would take?
Sorry.
Just follow on what they've told you, differs information. So if I take away sensory input from my fingers, if you look at that, what area might move in to that space? What's the area next door? So think about this, someone's vacated the bedroom next door neighbours, your face moves in. So these patients, if you touch their face, they'll swear you're touching their fingers that are no longer there. It's quite fascinating. Right? We use these techniques with our complex hand pain patients to use sensory reintegration. In the case of low back pain patients, if you have someone with chronic low back pain, and we've talked about how the map of the lower back increases, what do most people go and have done if they have chronic low back pain?
Yeah, massage.
Massage? Chiro? Physio? But generally it's going to be some tissue-based input. What do you think that will do to the map? Make it get bigger or make it get smaller? Because you're providing lots of sensory input to it. Bigger. So all you're helping to do is to distort that map further and further and further. So once again, it validates the evidence behind the treatment of chronic low back pain. Don't treat the back. You're not going to get better. If anything, you'll just keep feeding the process. So you see how the neuroscience now matches what we know with research. But people are making millions and millions of dollars telling people, oh, I can manipulate your back or I can massage it out their waist. Everyone is wasting their time and their money. It will not work. And the research is very clear on that. So, this is kind of where I want to stop today anyway, but do you have any questions or any thoughts of where we've got to today? Have I opened your eyes to a couple of little extra points that you need to consider?
What about a combination of triggering and strengthening? That philosophy, so lower back pain,
Yep.
Looking at what the anatomy, like their postural alignment, loosening, strengthening, is instead of just going straight for your loosening techniques. Do you know what I mean?
If you ask me to apply these principles,
it's different.
So if you think about, say, using a foam roller
Yep.
that you're talking about, and then doing some mobility work,
Yep.
what you need to think of is what is the sensory input that I'm providing to the nervous system at this time.
Yep. So what's the method for getting rid of that back pain?
Number one, there's no recipe.
Yeah.
Everyone's different.
Yeah.
So in some cases, you need to work more on sensory input, because remembering that some people get such a distortion, and I've had patients that will do this sort of thing. You know, classic case of a lady that had repeated SIJ trauma after falling from a horse. If this was the door to come through, the doorway, she would come through like this. Why did you do that?
Protect it.
No.
Protect it.
What did I just tell you gets bigger in your brain?
The size of it.
So what happens when you whack your thumb with a hammer? Does it feel big? Does it feel big? No, it doesn't swell. Does it feel big or does it feel small? It feels big, it does it instantly. That's the distortion. So in her case, this felt so big that she would literally dodge objects. I guarantee you get the same thing with knee pain patients. I've seen this all the time. You ask a chronic knee pain patient, this is a really interesting little test. Alright? Put that foot there. Ask them to pass their knee through the goalpost. What do you think someone with chronic knee pain will say to you? It won't fit. Because it feels big. But this sometimes is you might have to start like that. Because this can be quite anxiety provoking. I think, were you there with me that day with Dave when we did this? No. I even burst into tears with me. Is that anxiety provoking? But that's, over time, your orientation of your knee in space. These are the things where if you learn to integrate neuroscience into your clinical practice as exercise scientists, you'll be on a different level to your competitors.
You may even have seen that to a degree, like if you've seen a patient, client, family member before, and they go, check out how big my knee is, it's so swollen. And you look at it and you're like, I can't see that, it's huge.
Just remember to the patient, it feels big. It's like when you hit your thumb with a hammer, your thumb feels huge. So but what do you do when you hit your thumb with a hammer? Shake it. Shake it. What are all those things? Yeah, different forms of sensory input, aren't they? So what's your brain wants you to do really quickly? Tell me everything's okay. Give me some input. You see how even in day-to-day life, what we do is already what matches the science. It's really cool and it's quite fascinating in many respects, I think. But we just don't know we're doing it. It's like when people hurt their knee, what do you do? Why do people like neoprene wraps around their neck? What are you providing? Sensory input. Some people like that. Some people need that. Some people may need movement re-education. So coming back to your original question, if you think about pain, what a good clinician will do is they'll find what the nervous system is looking for. That's probably the best way I can answer your question. If you find what it is that that person's looking for, you'll generally get a good clinical result. Whether it be a very sensory orientated program, whether it be a very movement orientated program, or whether it be a release, strength, trigger pointing, like that deeper level of sensory input, but don't go in with a recipe.
Yeah.
Be ready to adapt and change. Yeah. Probably enough to that.
Yeah. So there's obviously a really complicated conceptually, and even I've worked under Stu for 5 years now, and I've had hours and hours of discussion with him on the concepts of pain and learning about what pain is and how to apply that to my patients, and I still feel I've got so much to learn in this area.
And this is my little satellite analogy. So just read that quote and just consider what we're talking about the sensory system being all these orbiting satellites going around the Earth all the time, shooting information back to the Earth or the brain about the health of the planet, in this case our nervous system. It's a bit of a different, certainly not tissue-based.
But I think the importance of these couple of tutorials that Stu's going to do to us is starting to understand that pain isn't a tissue-based mechanism, and that we don't just receive, like I said, we cut our finger and that's painful. But when it comes to working with athletes that are in pain, which we'll do, whether you're going in the clinical world or not, if you stay in the strength and conditioning, it's highly unlikely you're never going to see someone in pain. But understanding then all of the thoughts and beliefs that go into that, and that it's not just necessarily tissue-based that you can address, and that there may be fear with a low back pain patient with forward flexion and sort of trying to take more of a holistic approach to that, or an ACL athlete returning to sport, and if they have fear or anxiety about returning to sport and you return them to sport, the research will show they're more likely to do their knee again. You need to address all of the inputs, whether that be emotional or...
I'm just looking for, do you guys all listen to podcasts?
Yeah.
This one here. Criteria-based return to play. Dr. Claire Arden, awesome, very, very good podcast. Yeah, this is based, I think she's a Melbourne clinician, maybe? I think so. Criteria-based. So that's a really, I would encourage you maybe this weekend after what we just talked about, if you listen to this podcast, you'll probably find, because they'll touch on things like what we talked about, to the smell of the grass, the noise of the crowd, and it starts to consolidate some of the concepts. I was listening to this the other day driving home, and I thought it was a really good one. So Dr. Claire Arden, British Journal of Sports Medicine.
Is it just podcast and app, isn't it?
Yeah, the one I use is called Overcast. So the app that I use is Overcast, and then on there you can just choose, you can put in what you want to search for. So I've got British Journal of Sports Medicine, so you might put in sports science, for example, and then some good, strength training podcasts and all sorts of stuff. But they're great to listen to.
Yeah, thanks.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.